Time travel made possible. Environmental impact of settling 13 colonies. Let's talk about some environmental impacts of settling 13 colonies that happened during the time of colonization in the United States. Join Liber-Tea now while we examine the 13 colony settlement timeline alongside the impact on the Native Americans at the time. Like, subscribe, comment, and share this and other videos to start a conversation about these and other hot topics. Later, we'll explore some of the everyday household items that Europeans used in their daily life to help combat some of the day-to-day hardships of colonial life. So let's start with the land. Climate change, ecology, and the environment are all very current, trending topics here in 2022. Just check out every third video or meme on social media, and the topic is not far from our hearts and minds, as things should be. Can you imagine how much impact the Native Americans felt during these times of great environmental changes with the coming of a new population? Not just cultural or economical or even social, but actual habitat changes that were put upon them. As we've already learned, the Indians felt that all land, vegetation, and animals were there to be maintained, harvested, and resourced. However, no one could actually own anything. This all changed, and changed drastically and quickly with the new settlements. The first obvious changes were from the many trading posts that were popping up all over. Of course, native animals were deeply affected. Popular trends, as they happen today too, were quick to spring up and caused quite a stir. But of course, with this stir comes consequences. For example, beer pelt hats were all the rage. The beautiful fur and trims were the influencers' choice of go-to fashion. Coupled with the Indians' desire for quick and more efficient European weapons, beavers were quickly extinct, causing a great loss in the New England area. With the destruction and elimination of beaver houses came fewer and fewer ponds and watering holes, which served as homes for fish and thirst-quenching communities for deer, moose, and many other animals. Included in this disaster, Europeans brought over pigs for personal use, and the pigs were allowed to roam the forests and other fields, consuming what would typically be plentiful for the indigenous animals already there. Can anyone quickly guess the results of these thoughtless correlations? If you guess the natural game that the Native Americans, for thousands of years, had traditionally hunted were no longer available, then you would be correct. In other time travel videos, we've already briefly talked about the role of diseases and sicknesses that plagued the Indians. However, it would be good to know in a bit more detail just how devastating this was for the natives. The introduction of diseased microbes was probably the single greatest negative environmental impact for both human and beast. With this deadly introduction, there were no immunities whatsoever. This caused sickness and death in mass proportions anywhere and everywhere the colonists settled. In the early 1600s, pandemics took about 75% of the indigenous people. Let me repeat that, 75%. The Huron and Iroquois natives living near the Great Lakes died of smallpox, with both sides of the age spectrum suffering. It wasn't just deaths to be numbered, but it was also the knowledge, wisdom, and legacies lost from the elderly, and the hope, prospect, and future that the young would provide. If anyone has suffered through the death of a child, you will have the first-hand knowledge of the heartache and tragedy that these natives felt day upon day upon day. Coming to a lighter impact on the way of life for the British colonies, we find some very useful and handy objects that were introduced to this new land. Before fire departments were ever founded, communities gathered together to put out house and field fires. The fire bucket was one of the most useful tools brought over from Europe. Often it was made of very stable, heavy wood, and people would line up not only to pass buckets of water toward the raging fire, but also to pass empty buckets back to be filled again. A flail had two purposes. One was to be used as a weapon, a throwback from the Crusader era, and the other use was to beat crops in order to remove husks or seeds. A very sharp weapon. Candles were a large part of the colonial life, and most people made their own. Some of the more readily available ingredients were from boiled berries off of a bayberry bush or from collected skimmed animal fat. However, the most sought after and treasured ingredients were from the waxy material found in the head of a sperm whale. Not very animal-friendly, but back then, a godsend. Education was still very important for the colonists, and horn books were used mostly for boys, because it was considered not necessary that girls have an education too. Horn books were sheets of paper fixed to materials like wood, leather, or bone, and covered by thin strips of transparent horns. So what was left for girls? They had something called samplers, and no respectable girl was without hers. Often used for religious offerings to create works of picturesque art, a piece of embroidered cloth was used to practice basic and advanced needlework skills. Samplers could also be stitched purely to practice letters or numbers and be used in poems and family records. As always, humans find ways to make or create fun. It separates us from the other species. And in colonial times, it was no different. A funky gadget called a whirligig, which was a circular disc made of bone, clay, or even clothing materials, such as buttons, with a string pulled through the center. Pulling and releasing the string caused the whirligig to spin around. This would make the children laugh and dance about, a good result from an often very hard life. The last two popular objects we'll explore as we finish out this video's time travel will be able to peer into the personal lives and homes, and we would find in almost every home a warming pan and a salt cellar. Because of the harsh, cold climates, a warming pan, a round circular metal pan, was often used not only to cook in, but also to heat the nearby areas of the house and even cold bed sheets, moving the pan back and forth between the sheets quickly so as not to burn the fabric. Although a salt cellar was really just a small, often made of pewter, container with a hole in the top for the salt to come out, it actually held quite a bit of meaning, including indicating the social status of all dinners, especially when special guests came over to dine. Anyone seated above the salt, near the end of the table where the host was with the salt cellar, were the honored guests, and children or insignificant visitors were sat at the other end of the table, below the salt. The lasting impressions of the settled colonies had both positive and negative effects, not just on life back in our time travel period, but also today in a modern way as well. Join Liber-Tea next time as we continue our time travel march through history. Like, subscribe, comment, and share these and our other videos for a more insightful look into history and how it changed our lives and often indicates what's in store for us as humans in a global community for the future.